My name is Dorothy Frost, and I was born in Industrial, Illinois, on the farm, and I was born at home, and we moved into town later. I don't remember when we moved into town. But we lived at the edge of town. There was 3 acres. And then we were across the road from an apple orchard. And we always had a garden. I didn't know anybody in the world that lived any different as a kid. And in Illinois with no mountains, if it rained, I thought it was raining all over. And so I was kind of limited in my worldly knowledge. But I remember polishing a half bushel of apples over at the orchard and sold that half bushel for 50 cents. And the old man that owned the orchard let me keep the 50 cents. And that was something, because that was in the 30s. And anyway, my mother always had a garden, and I just thought I would too. And I always have gardened, and it's a blessing, because there were lean years, and I don't know what we'd ate if I hadn't raised a garden. And we came to Wyoming in 1951, and we were married in 49, right after I graduated out of high school. And I worked this summer before I got married for my cousin, so I got engaged in November, and she kind of thought we might be getting married. And so she had me can with her and keep some of the canned goods. So I had that to start housekeeping, which I thought was normal. Didn't think of going and buying anything.
I'm Joyce Dix Lynn. I live here in Powell. I originally came from Oklahoma. I was born and raised in Oklahoma on a farm, and then we moved to Wyoming. My family, my Dix family, moved to Wyoming in 1945, and so I've lived on a farm almost all my life, except at the time we moved into Powell, which was in 1996 that we moved to Powell. And so I've lived in Powell ever since. Otherwise, we lived on a farm, or we had a 10-acre allotment ourselves at one time, and we lived there, and we always had a big garden and fruit trees. And as for canning, it's just something I grew up with. My mother canned, and it's just something that you do when that's what you learn to do. I remember that there was a big market in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I was born close to, and so we would go there, and she would buy pineapple, big boxes of pineapple, and I remember canning pineapple from wherever they came from, because they certainly didn't grow in Oklahoma. But it was always interesting to me because I loved pineapple. And of course, by the time we got through, I had a sore mouth. It was so sour. But so canning is something that's in my blood, and I have not canned for the last, I guess, probably the last 4 or 5 years. But even when we moved to Powell, in town with just a lot to have for a yard, we grew tomato plants along our flower bed. So there was enough tomatoes there that I could can tomatoes even there. So that's kind of my background on where I come from and where this started.
Okay, I'm Ruby Lynn Hopkin, and like I said, I started helping to can when I was just a little girl, about 10, and I've canned ever since I was married, which was, my husband passed away not quite a year ago. We were married for 68 years, and I canned every year that we were married. Some years I'd can more than other years. And even last year, I canned tomatoes and peaches. But I think that's pretty much my history. I get chances sometimes to get fruit from someone who has something to share, or they'll maybe tell me that they have an apricot tree that's really full of apricots, and I still take advantage of that, and if I can't use it all myself, I share with my family.
Well, when the day was over, I didn't can just for fun. I wanted 100 of everything. Because when the kids were little, and all boys, they eat. And all I thought of was volume and that it would not spoil.
Well, I remember one time, this is in later years, we were doing green beans, and we always raised a large garden when I was a young mother, and we had 6 children. So we raised a large garden, and we depended on that for our winter's food. And we'd pick a lot of beans. We'd have a couple of bushels of green beans. Then we'd have our children downstairs watching TV and doing the snapping while I was upstairs doing the canning. And one day I had a lot of beans, and my daughter was helping me, my older daughter. I had borrowed my mother's pressure cooker, so we had 2 cookers going. And it ended up that we did 100 pints of beans that day. And watching 2 canners going, 2 pressure cookers, it was easy to get a little bit confused, even though we had a magic marker and writing on the lid what was going on. But this one time I remember the pressure went down. It seemed a little faster than usual, and I was kind of wondering why that happened. And then suddenly in my mind's eye I could see that pressure gauge, and instead of registering 12 pounds, which is what we do, just a little bit above 10 for our altitude, I could see that it was 7 pounds. I had pressure cooked that one canner full for only 7 pounds, which wouldn't have been enough, and they would have all spoiled. So I was glad that I had that inspiration, and I did them over, which assured me that they were going to be okay. But that was one incident that I just never have forgotten.
I remember one time that there were a lot of peas growing around Powell, and we could go out to the field and buy a whole box of peas, and they'd have some shells in them and whatever, but we were able to clean them up and then can those peas. So wherever we could find it, there wasn't much fruit grown here in Wyoming except apples, and of course we had apple trees, and so we had our own fruit there. But when the fruit was shipped into the stores, or somebody would go to Colorado or whatever and bring back a truckload, then we would buy from them and then canned apples and pears. And I remember one time too, we were on a trip to Washington State, and it was just the time when the blackberries were ripe. Well, to me, that was heaven. All of these blackberries, and my husband made the remark, if she could, she'd can every one of them. But we stayed at our friend's house. I canned blackberries while we were on our trip and brought them home, and they were delicious. I made lots of jam out of them.
I was probably 8 or 9, 10, just a little girl, and my sister was even younger. So we just have grown up with canning, and I've never in my life bought a can of green beans or corn. We have always had our own homegrown beans and corn, and this was before we had freezers. Home freezers weren't a thing back then, so everything we wanted to preserve had to be canned.
Well, put your jars away clean. That's the best thing you can do for yourself. And then make sure you read the directions. I had 2 pressure canners. I kept them going all the time. But I read, and I was picky. I got a stool, and I sat there, and I did whatever else I could do. when I was waiting for the pressure to come up, so it didn't surprise me. And I know they thought I was kind of wasting my time, I guess, but I had a friend who was doing shell beans, and the thing blew up and the lid on the ceiling. Anything I could do to keep from cleaning up a mess. A stitch in time, they used to say, and that covers a lot of stuff.
I'm glad that I had the opportunity to learn to and can, and especially I think it was a family thing in the fact that my sister and mother and I worked together. She was only 17 months younger than me, and so we were more like twins than anything, and both of us had big families, and so I had 5 children. She had 5 boys, and so they eat a lot of food, and it was just inspiring to have it there, always knowing that we would always have food. And it lasts much longer than if you buy a can of green beans or corn. You have to date it, and it will bulge in time, and you have to destroy it. One time I tested to see how long a jar of canned meat, it was beef in chunks, how long it would last. And I kept it for about 15 years and then opened it because I wanted to test to see how long it would last. And it was just as good as the day I canned it. So I was pleased with that. But we seldom lost fruit or vegetables in our jars, whereas in cans you had to watch your dates.
I remember when we were first married, that was in 1949, they had a cannery here in Powell. It was run by, it was a local thing, and the lady who worked there, I think, was probably hired by the city or whoever got this cannery started. But they had these large commercial pressure cookers, and you could just take your produce in there, and they would have the cans that you paid 10 cents each for, or whatever price it was. And then they would put them through the sealer and put them in this big cooker, and in half an hour you could do 100 pints or 100 cans. It wasn't like having to do them here at home. So in some ways it was an advantage. And there were some women who really enjoyed using that, and probably because they didn't want to mess up their kitchens. My mother used to go and can chicken, I remember. That was an easy thing to do there at the cannery. And one time she canned chili, and I think she even made some carrot pudding, steamed pudding that she put in there. And that was kind of fun to have.
When the garden was all done, that was great, because you knew that, but you always go out and check to see if there might be something else out there. So it kind of gets in your blood. I guess that's the way to put it. One of the funniest things that ever happened, you want to hear that? Well, we always did applesauce, and I put down newspapers and everything till the applesauce, we were through with the applesauce. And one day I saw Kurt, my second son. He was sitting at the end of the table and he's holding the paring knife, because the boys had to help me. Because when you do it by the volumes, I did a lot, but I couldn't get it all done by myself. And he just was sitting there like that, and I said, "What are you doing?" I thought, why aren't you cutting? And he said, "Well, Mom, there's a worm, and I don't know whether to cut him in half or drown him." Anyway, there were fun times, but they used to say, "Corn again today?" I can remember that because I'd be putting down the newspaper. Anyway, I like it. I like the canning, I like the freezing. I like living the life I live.